What will the United States look like in 30 years? Well, we don't need a crystal ball to get a pretty good idea. Today, we're going to walk through the latest demographic projections from the Congressional Budget Office. We'll break down their forecast and really get a handle on the big forces set to reshape the American population.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the big demographic shift happening in America. Then, we'll get into the specifics, the fertility question, the longevity factor, and immigration's central role. And to wrap it all up, we'll talk about why all of this really matters. Okay, let's dive into that first section, America's demographic shift. So what's the big story here? Well, if you boil down the entire CBO report, it really comes down to two major takeaways for the next 30 years. First, population growth is slowing, a lot. And second, the country as a whole is getting older. And this chart, wow, it really puts that slowdown into perspective, doesn't it? You can see here, between 2026 and 2036, the average growth rate is projected to be around 0.3% a year. But then, look what happens in the 2 decades after that. It drops to just 0.1%. And by the year 2056, the projection is that population growth will basically stop. It hits zero. You know, for a country that's always been defined by growth and expansion, this is a really fundamental change.
And here's a really major turning point we need to talk about. By 2030, and that's not far off at all, the number of deaths each year is expected to be higher than the number of births. Think about that for a second. It means that, for the first time, what demographers call natural change, just births minus deaths, will actually be negative.
The CBO puts it pretty starkly with this quote. Without immigration, the population would begin to shrink in 2030. That one sentence really says it all. It highlights just how critical immigration is to the entire demographic picture of the U.S. We're going to come back to this idea in a bit because it's absolutely central to the story.
So, let's ask the question, what's behind this massive slowdown? Well, the first big piece of the puzzle is fertility. The fact is, fewer births are having a really big impact on the country's future.
Okay, before we get into the actual numbers, there's a key idea we need to have in our back pocket, the replacement rate. It's pretty straightforward. It's the number of births per woman needed for a generation to just, replace itself. The magic number is 2.1. If you have 2.1 births per woman, your population stays stable, not counting immigration.
Now take a look at this. This chart really shows you where the U.S. stands. That top bar is the replacement rate we just talked about, 2.1. And the bottom bar, that's the projection for the U.S. in 2036, just 1.53. That is a huge gap. And it's not something new either. This trend of lower birth rates has been going on since the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. It's a really big part of why that overall population growth is slowing down so much. And if we break this down a little further, we see some interesting nuance. The fertility rate for foreign-born women is projected to be a bit higher, at 1.66. For native-born women, it's a little lower, at 1.50. But here's the key thing to notice. Both are still way below that 2.1 replacement rate. So this isn't a trend isolated to one group, it's happening across the board. All right, let's move on to the second major driver of this shift, the longevity factor. It's the other side of the coin from fertility. It's all about how long we're living, and it plays a huge role in why the population is getting older.
So, while we have fewer births happening, we also have people living longer lives, and you can see that steady climb right here on this timeline. In 2026, life expectancy at birth is projected to be 79 years. Fast forward to 2056, and it's up to over 82 years. When you put these two trends together, fewer births and longer lives, you get the exact recipe for an aging population.
Okay, which brings us to our third piece of the puzzle, and it's a big one, immigration's central role. Remember that quote from earlier? This is where it all comes together. According to these forecasts, immigration isn't just a driver of growth. It's soon going to be the only driver of growth.
So where is this net immigration coming from? This chart gives us a breakdown. The biggest slice, by far, represents lawful permanent residents. You might know them as green card holders, and others on a similar path. That's projected to be about 910,000 people a year. The other smaller slices are folks like students and temporary workers, but you can see that the bulk of the long-term projection is tied to permanent residency.
And here's the bottom line. Looking ahead from 2037 to 2056, net immigration is projected to average about 1.2 million people a year. Now remember what we said happens in 2030. That's when deaths start to outpace births. So after that point, this 1.2 million people per year becomes the sole reason the U.S. population doesn't shrink, is the only thing keeping the total population number from going down. Okay, so let's pull all these threads together.
We've got slower growth, an aging population, and immigration as the only thing propping up the numbers. So what? Why does any of this matter? In this last section, we're going to look at the real-world economic and social implications.
The core issue is that the U.S. population is getting older. The group of people aged 65 or older is projected to grow much, much faster than the younger working age groups. What this does is it creates a kind of imbalance, where the number of retirees grows quickly, but the number of workers who, support the economy and social programs grows much more slowly.
And this number here, 2.2 to 1, really drives that point home. Right now, today, for every person who is 65 or older, there are about 2.7 people in their prime working years. But by 2056, that ratio is expected to shrink to just 2.2 workers for every one older person. This is what's called the dependency ratio, and when it gets smaller, it means there are fewer workers to support a growing number of retirees, which of course puts a lot of strain on the whole system.
And that strain shows up in some really clear economic ways. For one, it means slower growth in the labor force. In fact, after 2042, the number of people in that key 25 to 54 age bracket is actually projected to start shrinking. That can slow down the whole economy, or GDP. And of course, it puts enormous pressure on federal programs. Think about Social Security and Medicare. You have more and more beneficiaries and a slower growing pool of workers paying into the system. That's a tough equation to solve.
So, if we step back and look at the big picture, it's pretty clear. All these forces, fertility, longevity, and immigration, are pointing in the same direction. The United States is on a path to becoming an older, slower-growing nation, a nation whose population will eventually be sustained entirely by immigration.
And that really leaves us with the big question moving forward. How will our society and our economy adapt to an older, slower-growing America? Understanding these trends is one thing. Figuring out how to navigate them is the challenge that lies ahead for all of us.